With Sir Keir Starmer set to address the UN later tonight, I spoke to the former British ambassador to the UN and now the chairman of the Geopolitical Advisory Gatehouse, Sir Jeremy Greenstock, and the former chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, the Conservative MP Alicia Kearns. Thanks both so much for joining us on Sky News this evening. So, Jeremy, can we start with you? I mean, it felt this morning like there was some optimism, like all the world leaders were gathered together. There could be a ceasefire, diplomacy might be working. But then there's this real disconnect between what's being said in New York and what's actually happening on the ground in the Middle East. Do you think there is much that the UN can actually do?
Well, there is a disconnect because the parties are not listening. And the optimism, I think, was completely misplaced because there was no reason to believe that either the Israelis or Hezbollah would agree to a ceasefire at this particular moment without knowing the conditions for that ceasefire. And probably on the Israeli side would not agree at this point at all. So we must look in this conversation to the reasons for that.
And what do you think the reasons for that are?
That Hezbollah is going to go on fighting until there is a ceasefire in Gaza, not in northern Israel. It's totally connected to the Gaza conflict. And I do not believe myself, and I think many observers would agree, that the Israelis can totally eradicate Hezbollah without an enormous war. And that would be bitter for all parties, including the Israelis. So we're a long way from any ceasefire on the current approach of the Israeli military into Lebanon at the moment.
OK, Alicia, when it comes to the new Labour government, how do you feel their handling of this has been?
Look, essentially the power is currently not sitting with the UK in terms of this. It's sitting with the US and France, clearly, who've moved forwards with this joint statement this morning. You've seen a number of countries sign it. It's interesting, given that David Lammy was one of the first to call for a ceasefire, that he hasn't signed this joint statement. But essentially the power does not sit with the UK in terms of it focusing on this. But the one thing I would say is that for too long, the UK has allowed Lebanon, the whole world has forgotten that Lebanon has been in a state of crisis. Now we are refocusing on Lebanon when for years it has been allowed to continue to drift in a way that has become fundamentally unfair for the people of Lebanon who've had no support at all.
What do you think Keir Starmer needs to do this evening to sort of show that leadership?
Well, the priority has to be getting British nationals evacuated. That is obviously what they are trying to do now. I'm worried that message isn't landing because there are still tens of thousands, we believe, of British nationals who are still in Lebanon. Then in terms of the priority is, of course, preventing escalation. Look, for the last few weeks, there hasn't been a focus on getting a ceasefire in Gaza. This potential military incursion into Lebanon has refocused people. They are now looking again about what we do to make sure that we have a ceasefire in Gaza as well. But the priority should be making sure that we are able to have along the southern border Lebanese armed forces. It is currently Hezbollah operated, Hezbollah maintained. But what we cannot risk, and my biggest concern, is that Hezbollah has been losing support in Lebanon. Not completely, and in the south it will continue to be completely entangled with families, but its support for Bashar al-Assad in Syria, the attacks it's made on critics, the way in which the 18 Hezbollah politicians have undermined the stability and democracy of Beirut and essentially of Lebanon itself, have undermined the trust that Lebanese have in them. And we have to remember that Hezbollah is fundamentally a Lebanese force. It is not a Palestinian one. And there is a risk with a ground invasion that Hezbollah gets a renewed support, invigoration from the people of Lebanon, and that would be a serious risk.
Jeremy, do you think groups like Hezbollah fear the UN?
No, because the UN has no teeth unless the governments involved at the UN agree to impose something through force. There's been no Chapter 7 mandate, an enforcement mandate from the Security Council. So it's purely rhetorical unless the major members of the UN can agree actually to take action. And I don't think they're going to intervene militarily or in any way other than diplomacy and rhetoric at this moment.
Do you think they have less teeth than when you were permanent representative to the UN?
No, the UN has never had teeth. After all, let's remember the UN in its political emanation is only the member states agreeing in the forum to do something under the UN Charter. The UN is not a separate body that can take action here. So It's a good place for people to meet who don't agree on things. It's a good place to issue rhetorical and diplomatic statements, but there's no sign of enforcement action coming out of this dialogue.
And Alicia, we've obviously heard lots of talk of a potential ground invasion. I mean, how close do you actually think we are to that?
We thought we were in the same place at the start of August. I remember having a conversation with you about exactly that. And obviously we were able to de-escalate and move back from that brink. But at this time, the Israelis are saying very clearly that they plan to do a ground invasion. They have launched something like, I think, 3,000 strikes over the last 3 days. They are running out of targets that will be as easy to strike from the air. They have been very focused in their airstrikes within Lebanon, although there's still been far too much civilian loss of life. So I think it does come to the point where if their target is to prevent Hezbollah from being able to fire into the north of Israel, they do feel that it is now time for a ground invasion. And ultimately, since October 7th, the UK and the US, one of our foremost priorities was preventing a ground invasion of Lebanon. So this is something that the international community has been fearing for a long time, and it's really been on the cusp since July.
So, Jeremy, Keir Starmer has talked about the need for responsible global leadership in the last 24 hours. Do you think Benjamin Netanyahu has been irresponsible?
I'm not going to comment, make personal comments about a particular leader, but I do think the Israelis have started something for which they've got no visible exit route at this moment, because they're only relying on military enforcement. They're only relying on the military lever. There's no sign of an approach to a diplomatic or political end to this. And without that, it's going to go on a long time. And we've all observed that Prime Minister Netanyahu needs conflict to keep himself in office. So it's becoming very political inside Israel as well as internationally.
So do you think he's closed off to the idea of a diplomatic end?
Unless he agrees to talk about a political end to this, he is closing it off. And I do not believe that military action can lead to a settlement in Israel's interests.
And Alicia, you mentioned earlier the possibility of evacuations. Do you think lessons will be learnt from what happened in, for example, Afghanistan? Do you worry that we could see a situation like that again?
I hope so. After every evacuation, there was always a lot of soul-searching within the Foreign Office where we say we're going to learn lessons. I know there was an enormous lessons learning operation after Afghanistan, but also after Sudan. But this is a really complex evacuation. You know, Sudan, we had neighbouring countries. We could do both air and sea evacuations. Here, we're relying on commercial for as long as Beirut Airport remains open. And obviously, there's no reason to expect at this point that Israel would target it. But it does look like we're getting to the point where commercial flights might stop. That then leads us to sea, which is always difficult. There is no such thing as a straightforward sea evacuation. We've got obviously HMS Duncan ready and deployed. We've got helicopters and also aircraft already pre-deployed at Akrotiri in Cyprus. So obviously, if possible, a preference will always be for an air evacuation. And obviously, we know PGHQ and the Foreign Office are working very hard to prepare on this. But there is no such thing as an easy evacuation. And yes, I hope that lessons have been learnt.
And so, Jeremy, as Alicia says, no such thing as an easy evacuation. How important is it that this government gets that right? I mean, we're already hearing that flights are full, that some people are struggling to get out of Lebanon. How concerning do you think that is?
Well, I think it's a worrying situation, and at least the government has begun to take action. If it had left it to, days ahead, it would be much worse. So I agree with Ms Kearns. We must try and do as much as possible by air before Beirut Airport is compromised. But I think before this is over, a sea evacuation is going to come into play.
OK, that's all we've got time for, unfortunately. But thank you both. Really interesting discussion. Thanks for talking to us on The Hub this evening.